The Detroit Lions are set to kick off their first round of OTAs this week. And today, we are going to take a look at the biggest matchups and the biggest things to look out for in the first week of voluntary OTAs. Well, the rookies start to get a look at the veterans start to get a look at the rookies, we start to get a more inside look at training camp outlooks, and everybody wins a little bit. So with all of that being said, let's kick it off today by taking a look at one of the biggest matchups early in OTAs, and that being Ennis Rakestraw and Terrion Arnold versus the veteran wide receivers. Now, it was said early on in rookie minicamp that Terrion Arnold looked phenomenal. He was sticky in coverage, had an interception, had a couple passes defended, had the QB look off of him because he was just too tight in coverage, and the ball would not fit in the window. And it was said that Ennis Rakestraw was making some plays out of the slot, on the boundary, making some good plays. But at the end of the day, they were making plays versus undrafted rookies, right? They were making plays versus Isaiah Williams. They were making plays versus the wide receiver from Duke. They were making plays from guys that weren't drafted or aren't even officially signed to the roster. And while it's very encouraging that they're doing good early in rookie minicamp, it's a whole different thing to cover Amon-Ra St. Brown. It's an entirely different thing to stick with Jameson Williams for the entirety of the route. It's an entirely different thing to stick with Donovan Peoples-Jones, a bigger, more physical wide receiver, and keep up with Khalif Raymond, a quick slot wide receiver. And I think it's going to be a really fun and very interesting thing to take a look at is how are they going to adjust? How are Terrion Arnold, how are Ennis Rakestraw going to match up versus St. Brown and Jameson Williams and Donovan Peoples-Jones and, Khalif Raymond as well as the wide receiver 4, potentially even Antoine Green being a step up from where they were at rookie minicamp. I think it's going to be a really interesting battle. I'm very, very excited to see Terrion Arnold step up to St. Brown. I'm very excited to see Ennis Rakestraw go up against Donovan Peoples-Jones in a battle of the more big physical players. And I think it's going to be a very fun thing to watch for the Detroit Lions to see where their rookies truly do stack up and how their potential future rookie tandem is going to look against two of, I would say, the tougher wide receivers to guard in the NFL. Obviously, Amon-Ra coming off of a 1,500-yard all-pro type of season, and Jameson Williams being a pretty underrated route runner, a guy that does get a lot of separation, a guy with some elite speed down the field. And I think it'll be really fun to see them go back and forth in this matchup and see who's going to win and step up to the plate when it matters. Now, another thing I do want to see kind of building off of that wide receiver thing is how are the Lions going to use Jameson Williams and Donovan Peoples-Jones, right? When they go to 11 on 11s, when they go to 7 on 7s, how much work does Jameson Williams get as the wide receiver 2? How much work does Donovan Peoples-Jones get as the wide receiver 3? And especially with the loss of Josh Reynolds this year, that's 70 targets. That's 70 passing attempts that Jared Goff now has to distribute to new weapons. And with Jameson Williams being a new wide receiver 2 and Donovan Peoples-Jones being a new wide receiver 3 with the first offseason in the system, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they work these guys into the offense. Does Jameson Williams see 50, 60 more targets next season? Does he see 30 or 40 with Donovan Peoples-Jones taking a nice chunk? Does Khalif Raymond see more work being one of the more reliable wide receivers in Jared Goff's arsenal over the last couple of years? Does Amon-Ra get more targets? Does Sam Laporta or Brock Wright get more targets? I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Ben Johnson starts to work Jameson Williams into the offense a little bit more. I think ended the season on a high note. Right about week 10 and on, he was a pretty consistent threat for the Detroit Lions, had a couple of touchdowns, had a couple of big plays, was great in the NFC Championship game, made a couple of nice grabs over the middle against the Raiders. I know he had a great game versus the Broncos, had a couple solid games versus the Vikings the first time around. He had a couple of really, really good games. And in his essentially rookie season, right, because he only had one reception, I think 3 targets as a true rookie, last year was Jameson Williams' rookie season. He put up over 500 all-purpose yards, including the playoffs, and 5 touchdowns. And for a 15, 16 game stretch, 500 yards for a rookie, not great for the 12th overall pick, but also something very encouraging to build off of. And now again, with a true offseason to work with Jared Goff, getting more reps as the true wide receiver 2, I do think there is some hope for Jameson Williams in the future. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how he's worked in the offense, how many targets he gets, how comfortable Jared Goff looks throwing to him, and overall, how the offense is going to adjust with the loss of their second biggest wide receiving threat. Now, Another thing I think is going to be really interesting to see is the starting secondary. How does the secondary line up? Is it Davis and Arnold on the boundary? Is it Davis and Rakestraw? Is it Arnold in Rakestraw? Is it Davis and Robertson or Davis and Mosley to start off the offseason, right? Do the rookies take a backseat early? I think it'll be really, really interesting to see how things play out on the boundary. But then even when you go into the slot, does Brian Branch play a more slot cornerback role? Does he play a more expanded role as a safety potentially with CJ Gardner-Johnson no longer in the building? If he does play at safety, who slides in at the slot? Is it Amik Robertson? Is it Ennis Rakestraw? Is it Maurice Norris? Is it, X, Y, and Z players? And then, of course, going into the secondary, right? Brian Branch is great, but if he's in the slot and Aaron Glenn wants to run a 3-safety set, who is that third safety? Is it CJ Moore? Is it Brandon Joseph? Is it a player that's not quite on the roster yet and they're working on signing on a free agency? I think it'll be really, really interesting to see how this roster looks based off of everything that I would assume. I would assume Carlton Davis is cornerback 1, Terrion Arnold is cornerback 2, Brian Branch is in the slot with Joseph and Melifonwu as the deep safeties. But again, in a 3-safety set, does Brian Branch drop deeper into coverage? Does he have a more expanded role outside of just the nickel? Where does Ennis Rakestraw fit in? Where does Emmanuel Mosley fit in? Where does Amik Robertson fit into this roster, right? There's a lot of players and a lot of playmakers in this secondary now, and I think there's going to be some really strong competition for players to get playing time opposite of Carlton Davis, or if Carlton Davis ends up being the cornerback 1 to begin with. Now, another thing to take a look at is the linebacker rotation. A player that I think is going to take a big step next year is Jack Campbell, but the Lions typically play 2 to 3 linebackers at a time. They don't like to put 4 or 5 linebackers on the field at a given player for a given drive. So who's going to get the big snaps? Obviously, Anzalone is the team captain. He's been here for a long time. I would expect him to start, but does Jack Campbell get more snaps? Does Derek Barnes get a large number of snaps after the way he finished the 2023 season and really the way he played all of the 2023 season? Does Malcolm Rodriguez get a big chance after an interception in the NFC Championship game, playing phenomenally versus the San Francisco 49ers? Where does Jalen Reeves-Maybin fit in? An all-pro from a season to go from the special team standpoint, but a blitz specialist, a good coverage linebacker for them. I do think they have 4 to 5 linebackers that could start in a number of NFL teams, but obviously they're not going to all be able to start. They're not all going to be able to play at the same time. So who plays linebacker 1 and 2? Who plays linebacker 3 and 4? How often does Jalen Reeves-Maybin fit into the defense? How often does Derek Barnes and Jack Campbell switch spots? How often does Alex Anzalone get reps off? How often does Rodriguez get an opportunity with the first team defense? There are 5 linebackers in this group that I think could start for the Detroit Lions and make plays, or at least rotate in and be significant contributors. I think it's going to be really interesting to see, one, if Jack Campbell takes that step forward, if Derek Barnes continues to grow, if Rodriguez can take that third year jump, if Anzalone can continue to make progress and continue to improve as a linebacker. There's a lot of storylines there in the linebacking core. I think it's going to be very fun to see how it all plays out. And then, of course, although it's a little bit selfish and everybody's going to be mad, I am excited to see Henden Hooker, the 3rd-round pick from a season ago, a potential Heisman finalist before tearing his ACL in 2022, 68th overall pick in the 2023 NFL draft class. And we finally get our first look at Henden Hooker as a player. We'll get a really good look, I would assume, in the preseason. I would guess he gets a lot of snaps, probably starting a majority of all 3 games. But we get our first look at Henden Hooker, a player with a lot of upside, a player with a great arm, a player with a great deep ball, a player with some really good athleticism, and a player that I think is a very intriguing prospect, right? Do you draft a player at 68th overall, a very big, impactful position, right? If you go back to 2023 draft, look at the players that went after Henden Hooker. You're talking about players with a lot of playing time, players with a lot to offer to their football team early, and spending that on a backup quarterback and potentially now a career backup quarterback with the Detroit Lions is a risky move. But do we see Henden Hooker ever play for the Detroit Lions? And if so, I want to see him play in the preseason. I want to see him play in, training camp. I want to see him play in OTAs. I want to see him spin the football. I want to see him get the ball out to his wide receivers. And for a player that was so explosive and a player that was so dynamic in college, I would like to see him play in the NFL, and I'm very excited to see what he can offer the Detroit Lions, whether that is a potential Taysom Hill-esque package, right, where you bring him in for some read options, you bring him in to add that element of QB running, QB power to your offense, whether it be a long-term developmental cycle where Jared Goff gets to 32, 33, and Henden Hooker takes over at age 28, 29, right? Whether it be a cheaper option down the road. I don't know what their plan is with Henden Hooker, but I'm excited to find out, and I'm excited to see where it all goes for the Detroit Lions. And with that being said, those are my biggest things to watch out for in OTAs. Obviously, we still have about a month or two before training camp. We have about 2.5 months until the actual NFL preseason begins. But we are starting to get back into the swing of NFL things. We're starting to get back into training camp. We're getting into OTAs. We're getting into workouts. We're getting in to see offseason pictures and highlights. And I think it's going to be a very fun offseason for the Detroit Lions to see what they have in the bag. But with all of that being said, that is live for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about the Detroit Lions, how you feel about their OTAs, what you're looking for going into OTAs and the biggest battles you're looking for. But with that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.